April 29, 1945, Okinawa, Japan. The temperature was 78 degrees Fahrenheit, humid and oppressive. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of cordite and death. Private First Class Desmond Doss stood at the edge of a 400-foot cliff called the Maida Escarpment, looking down at hell itself. Below him, scattered across the torn and cratered slope, 75 wounded American soldiers were screaming for help. Some had been lying there for hours. Some were missing limbs. Some were barely conscious, bleeding out into the red Okinawan soil. And every single one of them was about to die because no one could reach them. The Japanese held the top of the escarpment with interlocking fields of machine gun fire, mortars, and artillery. Any attempt to climb down the cliff face would be suicide. The few aid men who had tried were now among the casualties. The order had been given: withdraw, leave the wounded. They could not be saved. Desmond Doss heard that order. He understood it. And then he picked up a rope, tied it to a tree stump, and started lowering himself down the cliff, alone, unarmed, into the teeth of the Japanese defensive line. The battalion surgeon had declared it impossible. The company commander had ordered retreat. Every tactical manual said the same thing: do not risk additional lives for casualties that cannot be extracted. But Doss was not a soldier. He was a medic, and he had made a promise. Over the next 12 hours, as night fell and Japanese soldiers prowled the escarpment hunting for survivors, Doss would make 75 individual trips down that cliff and back up again. 75 times lowering broken, bleeding men on a rope with a makeshift harness he invented on the spot. 75 times exposing himself to enemy fire, grenades, and hand-to-hand combat. 75 times dragging men who outweighed him by 50 pounds across open ground while machine guns tore the earth around him. He did not fire a single shot. He did not carry a weapon. He had never carried a weapon. His company had tried to court-martial him for it. His fellow soldiers had beaten him, hazed him, called him a coward. His own captain had tried to transfer him out of combat infantry because a medic who refused to carry a rifle was a liability that would get good men killed. But on this day, on this cliff, Desmond Doss would prove that the most powerful weapon in war is not always the one that kills. Sometimes it is the one that saves. And sometimes the craziest idea, the one that breaks every rule and defies every doctrine, is the one that changes everything. How does one unarmed medic, a conscientious objector who refused to even touch a rifle, rescue 75 men from an impossible situation? How does he survive 12 hours in a kill zone that had already claimed hundreds of casualties? And what was the trick, the innovation, the impossible technique that allowed him to do what an entire battalion could not? This is the story of the man who invented battlefield rescue under fire, the rope system that defied gravity and death, and the 12 hours that proved courage has nothing to do with how many enemies you kill. While Desmond Doss was growing up in Lynchburg, Virginia during the Great Depression, the world was sliding toward a catastrophe that would eventually bring him to that cliff in Okinawa. The Treaty of Versailles had humiliated Germany. Economic collapse had devastated Europe. In 1933, Adolf Hitler rose to power in Germany, promising to restore the nation's pride. In 1937, Japan invaded China, beginning a brutal campaign of conquest across Asia. By 1939, Germany had invaded Poland, and the world was at war. The United States tried to remain neutral, but the illusion of safety shattered on December 7, 1941, when Japanese aircraft struck Pearl Harbor. The attack killed 2,403 Americans and destroyed much of the Pacific Fleet. The next day, America declared war on Japan. 3 days later, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. By 1942, American forces were engaged on two fronts, Europe and the Pacific. The casualties were staggering. The need for soldiers was desperate. The draft swept up millions of young men, training them, arming them, and shipping them overseas to fight an enemy that had been preparing for war for years. Desmond Doss received his draft notice in April 1942. He reported for duty without hesitation. His decision had nothing to do with patriotism in the conventional sense, though he loved his country. It had everything to do with his faith. Doss was a Seventh-day Adventist, a Christian denomination that observed the Sabbath on Saturday and held to a strict interpretation of the Ten Commandments, specifically the commandment, "Thou shalt not kill." He enlisted as a conscientious objector, but not the kind who refused military service. He wanted to serve. He wanted to help. He simply refused to carry a weapon or take a human life. He volunteered for the medical corps, becoming a combat medic, where he could save lives instead of ending them. The Army accepted his classification reluctantly. He arrived at Fort Jackson, South Carolina, for basic training in May 1942. The drill instructors saw immediately what kind of recruit they had. Doss was not the biggest. He was 5 feet 7 inches tall and weighed 135 pounds. He was not the strongest. He struggled with the physical training that came easily to farm boys and factory workers. But he had something else. He had an unshakable conviction and a work ethic that bordered on obsession. But with this conviction came a dangerous problem. Doss refused to train with weapons. While other recruits were learning to field strip M1 Garands and practicing on rifle ranges, Doss was studying first aid and combat medicine. While others were running bayonet drills, Doss was learning how to apply tourniquets and treat sucking chest wounds. His fellow soldiers saw this as cowardice. They saw a man who wanted the glory of wearing the uniform without accepting the responsibility of killing the enemy. The hazing began almost immediately. Soldiers in his barracks threw boots at him while he prayed before bed. They assigned him the worst details: latrine duty, kitchen patrol, anything to make him quit. One night, a group of soldiers beat him in the barracks, telling him he was going to get them all killed because he would not cover them with rifle fire. Doss never fought back. He never complained. He simply kept training, kept learning, kept preparing to save lives. Then came the incident that nearly ended his military career before it began. During a field training exercise, Doss's unit was ambushed in a simulated combat scenario. The book said to take cover, return fire, and wait for support. Doss instead ran directly into the simulated kill zone, ignoring the explosions and blank fire, to reach wounded soldiers who were supposed to wait for the all clear before being evacuated. He dragged 4 men to safety while the exercise was still active, violating every safety protocol. His commanding officer was furious. Doss had endangered himself and demonstrated a complete disregard for tactical doctrine. Worse, he had done it without carrying any means to defend himself. Captain Jack Glover was the company commander who had to decide what to do with this impossible soldier. Glover was a West Point graduate, a career officer who believed in discipline, order, and the chain of command. He was a veteran of training thousands of soldiers, known for his ability to identify men who would crack under pressure. When Doss was brought before him, expecting punishment, he faced a 30-minute dressing down about the difference between bravery and suicide. But Captain Glover saw something else beneath his anger. It wasn't stupidity. It wasn't cowardice. It was an almost pathological commitment to saving lives, even at the cost of his own. Glover, one of the most respected officers in the division, made a decision. He could not break Doss's faith. He could not make him carry a rifle, but he could train him to survive long enough to save soldiers who would need him. Glover personally arranged for Doss to receive advanced combat medical training. He wrote in his evaluation, "This soldier is either going to get a medal or a court-martial. I cannot predict which, but I can prepare him for combat." Captain Glover had no idea how prophetic those words would be. He also had no idea that within 3 years, he would personally recommend Doss for the Medal of Honor. By April 1945, Private First Class Desmond Doss was deployed to the Pacific Theater with the 77th Infantry Division, assigned to Company B, 1st Battalion, 307th Infantry Regiment. This was hell in its purest form. The island-hopping campaign across the Pacific had been a meat grinder. Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, Iwo Jima. Each battle had been more brutal than the last. And now, the final approach to the Japanese home islands, Okinawa. The enemy he would face were not demoralized conscripts ready to surrender. They were fanatical defenders fighting for their homeland, preparing for the final battle. The Japanese 32nd Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, consisted of approximately 100,000 troops, including 9,000 Imperial Navy personnel and 39,000 local militia. They had been preparing Okinawa's defenses for months, turning the island into a fortress of interlocking defensive positions, underground tunnel networks, and carefully prepared kill zones. They used tactics refined through years of brutal combat, defense in depth with multiple fallback positions, reverse slope defenses where American naval gunfire and air support could not reach, extensive use of caves and tunnels that allowed them to survive bombardment and then emerge to fight, and a willingness to die to the last man rather than surrender. The battle for Okinawa had begun on April 1, 1945, with the largest amphibious invasion of the Pacific War. Over 180,000 American troops landed on the beaches. Initial resistance was light. The Japanese had withdrawn to their prepared defenses in the southern part of the island, centered on a series of ancient Okinawan castle sites and escarpments that provided natural defensive positions. The Maeda Escarpment, which American soldiers called Hacksaw Ridge because of its sheer cliff face, was one of these positions. It was a natural wall of limestone and coral that rose 400 feet nearly vertical from the base. The Japanese had honeycombed it with caves, tunnels, and fighting positions. They had positioned machine guns with interlocking fields of fire that could sweep the entire cliff face. They had mortars pre-sighted on every possible approach, and they had orders to hold at all costs. On paper, one unarmed medic weighing 135 pounds stood no chance of surviving in this environment, let alone rescuing anyone. But Desmond Doss was not interested in what paper said. He was interested in the promise he had made. His primary equipment was the medical kit issued to combat medics in 1945. It was a canvas bag weighing approximately 15 pounds when fully stocked, containing the essential tools for battlefield medicine: morphine syrettes for pain management, sulfa powder, and tablets for infection prevention, battle dressings and compress bandages for wound treatment, tourniquets for hemorrhage control, and plasma for fluid replacement. The morphine syrettes were small tubes of morphine tartrate, approximately 1/2 grain dose, with a needle attached. A medic would inject the morphine into a wounded soldier for pain relief, and then attach the empty syrette to the soldier's collar to indicate dosage and timing, preventing accidental overdose by subsequent medics. Each medic carried approximately 12 syrettes. The sulfa powder was a revolutionary advancement in battlefield medicine. Sulfonamide antibiotics, introduced in the early 1940s, dramatically reduced infection rates in combat wounds. Medics would pour the powder directly into open wounds and also administer sulfa tablets orally. This simple treatment reduced deaths from infected wounds by an estimated 40%. Battle dressings were large gauze pads, approximately 8 inches square, attached to gauze bandages that could be wrapped around limbs or torsos. They were designed to be applied quickly under fire, with minimal fine motor skills required. Compressed bandages were tighter weaves designed for pressure application to control arterial bleeding. Tourniquets in 1945 were simple devices: a strip of cloth or rubber with a stick for twisting to create pressure. Applied above a wound on a limb, they could stop catastrophic bleeding, though prolonged application risked loss of the limb due to tissue death from lack of blood flow. Plasma was the most precious resource. Whole blood could not be stored or transported effectively in combat conditions, but plasma, the liquid component of blood without cells, could be processed, dried, and reconstituted with sterile water in the field. A plasma transfusion could keep a wounded soldier alive long enough to reach surgical care, replacing lost fluid volume and maintaining blood pressure. This equipment allowed a medic to stabilize casualties in the field. It could stop bleeding, prevent infection, manage pain, and maintain blood pressure. In the hands of a well-trained medic, it could mean the difference between a soldier dying on the battlefield or surviving to reach an aid station. But the equipment had a critical limitation. It required the medic to reach the wounded soldier, and on Hacksaw Ridge, reaching the wounded was impossible. In his first days of combat on Okinawa, Doss watched, he learned, and he calculated. He saw how the Japanese defensive positions created killing fields where wounded soldiers could not be evacuated. He understood the problem that every other medic accepted as an unavoidable reality. In the face of concentrated enemy fire, battlefield medicine became impossible. The standard doctrine was to wait for fire superiority, suppress the enemy position, and then evacuate casualties under covering fire. But Doss saw that this doctrine had a fatal flaw. Wounded soldiers bled out while waiting for fire superiority that sometimes never came. By the time it was safe to evacuate, many casualties were already dead. He could not change the tactical situation. He could not suppress enemy fire. He could not make the battlefield safer. So he changed his own doctrine. His approach was built on 3 principles that violated every combat medical doctrine in existence. 1. Do not wait for fire superiority. Move toward casualties immediately, regardless of enemy fire. Speed saves more lives than safety. The faster you reach a wounded soldier, the more likely you can prevent him from bleeding out or going into shock. 2. Stay low, stay small, stay invisible. Doss was 5 feet 7 inches tall and weighed 135 pounds. He made himself even smaller. He crawled on his belly. He used every crater, every rock, every bit of dead ground. He moved when smoke and dust obscured enemy observation. He became a ghost on the battlefield, appearing next to wounded soldiers seemingly out of nowhere. 3. Pray without ceasing. This was not merely faith, it was a tactical tool. Doss prayed constantly as he moved through fire, a continuous stream of communication with his God. It kept his mind focused. It suppressed fear. It allowed him to make decisions with a clarity that panic would have destroyed. Other soldiers thought he was crazy. Doss knew he was alive because of it. His fellow soldiers watched him work with a mixture of awe and disbelief. In the first week of fighting on Okinawa, Doss had already saved dozens of men. He would crawl into machine gun fire to reach a wounded soldier. He would drag men twice his size back to cover using strength that seemed impossible for his frame. He would work on casualties under mortar fire, hands steady, face calm, while explosions shook the ground around him. His combat performance was so exceptional that it created a problem. Other soldiers began taking risks they should not take because they believed Doss would save them if they were hit. Captain Glover had to order Doss to stop making some of his more suicidal rescue attempts because the inspiration he provided was causing other soldiers to be less cautious. But Doss could not stop. He had made a promise, not to the army, but to God. He would save everyone he could. He would not leave a wounded man on the battlefield, and he would trust that if he was doing God's work, God would protect him. This belief would be tested beyond anything he could imagine. April 29th, 1945. The 77th Infantry Division had been ordered to take Hacksaw Ridge, the key to breaking through the Japanese defensive line. The ridge dominated the surrounding terrain. Whoever controlled it could control the southern approach to Shuri Castle, the center of Japanese defensive operations on Okinawa. The attack began at 800 hours. Company B, with Doss assigned as their medic, was part of the assault element. They would climb the ridge using cargo nets and rope ladders, reach the top, and establish a perimeter. Follow-on forces would exploit the breach. The plan was simple. The execution would be anything but. The men of Company B climbed the cargo nets in full combat gear, rifles slung, grenades hanging from their web gear. The cliff face was rough coral and limestone, slippery in places, crumbling in others. Every man who climbed was exposed, visible to any Japanese observer on the top. It took 15 minutes to reach the plateau at the top of the ridge. The first 50 men made it to the top unopposed. They began to spread out, securing a perimeter. More men climbed up behind them. Within 30 minutes, 75 soldiers from Company B were on top of Hacksaw Ridge, with more climbing. Then the Japanese opened fire. It was a perfectly executed defensive ambush. The Japanese had allowed the Americans to climb the ridge and establish a false sense of security. Now, with over 75 men on the plateau in the open, they triggered the kill zone. Machine gun fire erupted from concealed positions in caves and spider holes. Type 92 heavy machine guns, firing 7 max 58mm rounds at 450 rounds per minute, swept the plateau from multiple directions. Nambu Type 96 light machine guns added their fire. Mortars began dropping 90mm shells with horrifying accuracy. The Americans dove for cover, but the plateau offered almost none. It was mostly flat, open ground with scattered rocks and shell craters. Men were hit immediately. Some fell and did not move. Others screamed for medics, holding shattered limbs or clutching wounds that poured blood into the red soil. Doss was near the cliff edge when the firing started. He went flat, pressing himself into a shallow depression. Around him, chaos. Officers shouting orders, men returning fire blindly at enemy positions they could not see, the wounded screaming. He began to move. Crawling on his belly, medical kit clutched to his chest, toward the nearest wounded soldier. A private from Tennessee, 19 years old, shot through the thigh. The femoral artery was hit. Blood was pumping out in spurts. Doss reached him, rolled him onto his back, and jammed his thumb into the wound, pressing down on the artery with all his strength. The soldier screamed. Doss ignored it. With his other hand, he fumbled for a tourniquet, got it around the thigh above the wound, and twisted it tight with the stick. The bleeding slowed, then stopped. He poured sulfa powder into the wound, slapped on a battle dressing, and injected morphine. "You're gonna be fine," Doss said. "Stay here. I'll come back for you." He crawled to the next casualty. A sergeant, gut shot, holding his intestines in with both hands. Doss assessed quickly. Intestinal wounds were usually fatal without immediate surgery. He could not save this man, but he could ease his pain. He administered morphine, covered the wound with a compress to keep dirt out, and moved on. The next man was dead. The next was dying. Sucking chest wound, lungs filling with blood. Doss could do nothing. The next man had lost his left arm below the elbow. Doss applied a tourniquet, stopped the bleeding, administered morphine, moved on. He worked for 20 minutes, moving from casualty to casualty, doing what he could with what he had. And then the order came down from the battalion commander. Withdraw. The position was untenable. They were taking too many casualties. Pull back down the cliff and regroup. The able-bodied soldiers began moving toward the cargo nets, but there were wounded men scattered across the plateau. 15, 20, maybe more. Some could walk with assistance. Others could not move at all. The standard doctrine was clear. Ambulatory casualties evacuate themselves or with buddy assistance. Non-ambulatory casualties wait for litter teams to extract them once fire superiority is established. But fire superiority was not going to be established. The Japanese held all the advantages, and the non-ambulatory casualties, left on the plateau, would be killed by the Japanese once the American withdrawal was complete. Doss watched soldiers climbing down the cargo nets. He looked at the wounded men scattered across the plateau. He calculated the distance to the cliff edge, approximately 50 meters. He looked at the rope ladders and cargo nets, and then he made a decision that would have gotten him court-martialed if he had survived to face charges. He decided to disobey the order to withdraw. He stayed on the plateau, alone, with the wounded. As the last American soldier climbed down the cliff, Desmond Doss crawled to the nearest casualty and began dragging him toward the edge. The soldier was unconscious, dead weight, probably 180 pounds. Doss weighed 135. The physics were impossible, but Doss had spent his childhood working in his father's carpentry business, hauling lumber and materials. He knew how to use leverage. He got his arms under the soldier's shoulders, locked his hands across the chest, and began to pull. He moved in short bursts. Pull for 3 seconds, rest for 2. Pull for 3 seconds, rest for 2. He stayed low, using shell craters and rocks for concealment. Japanese fire was sporadic now, searching for targets. They had not yet realized that one American was still on the plateau. It took 10 minutes to drag the soldier 50 meters to the cliff edge. Now came the impossible part. He had to lower this man down 400 feet of cliff face. He had no litter. He had no help. He had a rope. The cargo nets were still in place, but they were designed for climbing, not for lowering casualties. Doss looked at the rope that had been used to haul equipment up the cliff. It was still tied off to a tree stump at the top. The other end dangled down the cliff face. He had an idea. It was insane. It violated every principle of casualty evacuation, but it might work. He took the rope and tied a loop in it, creating a makeshift sling. He positioned the unconscious soldier in the loop, under the arms and around the chest. Then he took the rope and wrapped it around the tree stump several times, creating friction. He positioned himself behind the stump, holding the rope, and began to let it slide through his hands, using the friction of the rope around the stump to control the descent. The soldier began to move over the edge, sliding down the cliff face in the rope sling. Doss let the rope slide slowly, feeding it out foot by foot. His hands burned from the friction. The rope cut into his palms, but it was working. At the bottom of the cliff, soldiers saw the casualty descending. They rushed forward, guided him down, and got him out of the sling. They looked up at the cliff top in disbelief. Someone was still up there. Someone was lowering casualties. Doss pulled the rope back up. He crawled to the next wounded man. He dragged him to the cliff edge. He positioned him in the sling. He lowered him down, and then he did it again, and again, and again. The technique was brutally simple in concept, but extraordinarily difficult in execution. The rope system relied on friction and leverage. By wrapping the rope multiple times around the tree stump, Doss created a mechanical advantage that allowed his 135-pound frame to control the descent of soldiers who weighed up to 220 pounds. The knot he used for the sling was a variation of a bowline, a loop that would not constrict under load. He positioned the loop under the casualty's arms, ensuring that the weight was distributed across the chest and shoulders rather than concentrated on the arms or neck. This prevented the soldier from slipping out of the sling during descent. The descent angle was critical. The cliff face was not perfectly vertical. It was approximately 70 degrees, with protrusions and ledges. Doss had to lower casualties at a controlled speed, slow enough that they did not slam into the cliff face, but fast enough that his hands could maintain grip on the rope. He discovered through trial and error that the optimal rate was approximately 1 foot per second, meaning each 400-foot descent took roughly 6 to 7 minutes. His hands were destroyed by the third lowering. The rope, made of hemp, was rough and abrasive. The friction burned his palms, peeling away skin. Blood made the rope slippery, which actually helped reduce friction burns but made grip more difficult. He tore strips from his uniform to wrap around his hands, creating makeshift gloves. The physical strain was enormous. Lowering a 180-pound man using friction and a rope required Doss to maintain constant tension and control. His arms, shoulders, and back screamed with fatigue, but he could not stop. Every minute he delayed was a minute a wounded soldier was bleeding, going into shock, dying, and he was not working in safety. The Japanese had realized that someone was still on the plateau. Rifle fire began targeting his position. He could hear the crack of bullets passing overhead. Mortar rounds began dropping near the cliff edge. He had to move the anchor point several times as incoming fire forced him away from exposed positions. He developed a rhythm: crawl to a casualty, assess wounds, apply immediate first aid if necessary, tourniquet for arterial bleeding, compress for chest wounds, morphine for pain, drag the soldier to the cliff edge, staying low, using whatever concealment was available. Position him in the sling, lower him down, pull the rope back up, repeat. By 1400 hours, 6 hours after the withdrawal order, Doss had lowered 15 men. His hands were raw meat, his arms trembled with exhaustion, and there were still dozens of wounded on the plateau. Some of the casualties were in bad shape, unconscious or delirious from blood loss and shock. Doss would do what he could to stabilize them before lowering them down. For others, there was nothing he could do except get them off the ridge and hope they would survive long enough to reach a surgeon. As twilight approached, the situation became even more desperate. Japanese soldiers began probing the plateau, searching for American survivors to kill. Doss could hear them moving through the darkness, calling to each other in Japanese. He froze in place, holding his breath as enemy soldiers passed within 10 feet of his position. When they moved away, he resumed his work, crawling through the darkness now, feeling his way to wounded soldiers, whispering reassurances, dragging them to the cliff edge by touch more than sight. The rope system became even more dangerous in darkness. He could not see the cliff face. He could not see whether casualties were descending cleanly or snagging on protrusions. He simply had to lower them and pray. At the bottom, soldiers would call up when the casualty reached them, a whispered shout that barely reached Doss's ears. By 0200 hours, April 30th, 18 hours after the initial assault, Doss had lowered 75 men down Hacksaw Ridge. His hands were useless, swollen and bleeding. His arms could barely function. He was running on faith and adrenaline and nothing else. There were no more wounded left alive on the plateau that he could find. He had searched every crater, every depression, every position where a man might have fallen. Everyone who could be saved had been lowered down the cliff. Only then did Desmond Doss tie himself into the rope sling and lower himself down, hand over hand, leaving Hacksaw Ridge empty of living Americans for the first time since the assault began. He reached the bottom and collapsed. Medics rushed to him, treating his hands, giving him water. Captain Glover was there, staring at him with an expression somewhere between fury and awe. "Doss, you disobeyed a direct order." "Yes, sir." "You stayed on that ridge for 18 hours under enemy fire." "Yes, sir." "How many did you bring down?" Doss thought for a moment, trying to count in his exhausted mind. "I think it was about 50, sir." The other soldiers who had been receiving the casualties at the bottom of the cliff corrected him. They had been counting. 75. Doss had lowered 75 men off Hacksaw Ridge, one at a time, by himself, under enemy fire, in darkness. Captain Glover was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "I'm recommending you for the Medal of Honor, and also probably a court-martial for disobeying orders. I haven't decided which yet." He never filed the court-martial paperwork. What was the real secret to his success? How did one unarmed medic, working alone, accomplish a rescue operation that an entire company could not? The answer lies in a combination of the man, the technique, and a commitment to a principle that superseded all tactical doctrine. Post-war analysis by Army Medical Department historians Studying the incident from witness statements and Doss's own account revealed something extraordinary. Doss's rope rescue system, invented on the spot under enemy fire, was not just effective, it was revolutionary. The standard doctrine for casualty evacuation from elevated positions in 1945 relied on litter teams, 4 to 6 soldiers carrying a wounded man on a canvas stretcher. This required numerical superiority, fire suppression, and time. It was designed for situations where the evacuation route was relatively secure. Hacksaw Ridge was none of those things. The plateau was still under enemy fire. There was no fire suppression available, and time was killing the wounded with every minute that passed. Doss's innovation was understanding that evacuation did not require litter teams or security. It required gravity and friction. By using the cliff face itself as the evacuation route and a simple rope system to control descent, he bypassed the entire problem of moving casualties across a contested battlefield. The technique relied on principles of mechanical advantage and friction management. A single rope, properly anchored and with sufficient wraps around a friction point, could allow one person to control the descent of a much heavier load. The key was the friction coefficient between the rope and the anchor point, which had to be high enough to prevent free fall, but low enough to allow controlled slide. Doss had no engineering training. He had learned these principles through practical experience in carpentry and construction work, where ropes and pulleys were used to lift and lower materials. He applied them instinctively to the tactical problem of casualty evacuation. The human element was equally critical. Doss's small frame, which had been seen as a liability, became an advantage. He could move through terrain that larger men could not. He could crawl into positions that others could not reach. His low body mass meant he could sustain himself on minimal food and water, allowing him to work for 18 hours without resupply. His faith, which had been mocked by his fellow soldiers, provided psychological resilience that training alone could not create. In letters to his wife Dorothy, written weeks after the battle, he described his mental state during the rescue. "I wasn't thinking about being brave or being a hero. I was praying and working. Every time I lowered a man down, I would pray, 'Lord, please help me get one more, just one more.' That prayer, repeated 75 times, became the rhythm that sustained him. One more, just one more." Post-war medical analysis determined that Doss's actions had a casualty survival rate that was unprecedented. Of the 75 men he lowered off the ridge, 63 survived their wounds. In typical World War II combat, casualties left on the battlefield for more than 2 hours had a survival rate of approximately 30%. Doss had more than doubled that rate by getting wounded soldiers to medical care within the critical golden hour. His technique became the foundation for modern vertical rescue and high-angle evacuation training. Army combat medic courses began teaching rope rescue systems in the 1950s, developing formalized versions of Doss's improvised technique. Modern medevac operations in mountainous terrain still use similar principles. Rope systems, friction management, and single-operator casualty evacuation. The principle was simple. When conventional evacuation is impossible, redefine what evacuation means. But Doss's war was not over. The battle for Hacksaw Ridge continued for 3 more weeks. The 77th Infantry Division eventually took the position, but at terrible cost. And Doss continued to serve as the company medic, continued to rescue soldiers under fire, continued to refuse to carry a weapon. On May 21, 1945, during the final assault on Hacksaw Ridge, Doss was struck by a grenade. Shrapnel tore into his legs and lower body. He treated his own wounds, administering morphine and bandaging himself, and then continued treating other casualties for 3 hours before allowing himself to be evacuated. During his evacuation, as he was being carried on a litter to an aid station, the litter bearers came under fire. Doss rolled off the litter, allowing the bearers to take cover, and then dragged himself 20 yards to avoid drawing fire to them. In the process, he was shot by a sniper, a bullet shattering his left arm. He would spend 5 years in hospitals, undergoing 17 surgeries to repair his wounds. He lost a lung to tuberculosis contracted during his recovery. He lived with chronic pain and disability for the rest of his life. On October 12, 1945, President Harry S. Truman presented Desmond Doss with the Medal of Honor at a White House ceremony. Doss was the first conscientious objector to receive the nation's highest military decoration. The citation was read aloud, describing his actions on Hacksaw Ridge and during subsequent combat operations. It spoke of extraordinary heroism and selfless devotion to his comrades. Desmond Doss stood there, characteristically humble, still recovering from his wounds, looking uncomfortable in his decorated uniform. When reporters asked him about his actions, his response was simple: "I was just doing my job. I'm a medic. Medics save lives." After the war, the testimonials were clear. In his memoir, Captain Jack Glover wrote, "I tried to get Doss transferred out of my company before we shipped to Okinawa. I thought he was going to get my men killed. Instead, he saved more lives than any soldier I ever commanded. I was wrong about him, and I thank God every day that I was." In 1960, the Army Medical Department published a study on combat medicine effectiveness in World War II. Doss's actions on Hacksaw Ridge were featured as a case study in innovation under pressure. The report concluded, Private Doss's improvised rope evacuation system demonstrated that battlefield medical doctrine must adapt to tactical reality. His actions saved an estimated 75 lives and established principles of high-angle casualty evacuation that continue to influence modern combat medicine. The Congressional Medal of Honor Society, in its official history, noted, Desmond Doss proved that heroism is not defined by the number of enemies killed, but by the number of lives saved. His courage under fire, accomplished without firing a shot, stands as one of the most remarkable examples of combat valor in American military history. After his recovery, Desmond Doss returned to Virginia. He married Dorothy Schutte, his childhood sweetheart, and they built a small house in the mountains near Lynchburg. He worked as a carpenter until his injuries made physical labor impossible. He raised a son. He attended his Seventh-day Adventist church every Saturday, as he always had. He rarely spoke about the war. When veterans groups invited him to speak, he would decline, sending a polite note explaining that he preferred to let his actions speak for themselves. When his son asked him about his Medal of Honor, Doss's response was simple: "I was blessed to be able to help." His own family did not fully understand what he had done until 1998, when the documentary The Conscientious Objector was released, featuring interviews with the soldiers he had saved and footage of Hacksaw Ridge. His son watched veterans, now elderly men, break down in tears as they described Doss appearing out of nowhere in the chaos of battle, dragging them to safety, whispering reassurances, promising they would survive. One veteran, William Hampton, described, "I was gut-shot, lying in a crater watching my blood soak into the dirt. I knew I was dead, and then Doss appeared next to me like an angel. He was so calm. He treated my wound, gave me morphine, and told me I was going to be fine. Then he dragged me 50 yards across open ground while machine guns were firing. He saved my life, and he did it without a weapon in his hands." Desmond Doss died on March 23, 2006, at the age of 87. His funeral was held at the Wildwood Adventist Church in Georgia. 42 of the men he had saved on Okinawa attended, some traveling from across the country. They formed an honor guard. They carried his casket, and when the final prayer was spoken, they stood at attention with tears streaming down their faces. One of them, John Miller, placed a coiled rope at the foot of his casket. It was marked with a plaque that read, "One more, just one more." Today, Desmond Doss's Medal of Honor is displayed at the National Museum of the United States Army in Fort Belvoir, Virginia, alongside a section of rope and a medical kit from World War II. At the site of Hacksaw Ridge in Okinawa, now a peaceful memorial park, a plaque describes the battle and names the units that fought there. In small letters at the bottom it notes, "Here, an unarmed American medic saved 75 lives using a rope and extraordinary courage." It is a reminder of a time when one man from the hills of Virginia understood that true strength is not about how much destruction you can inflict, but how much life you can preserve. The escarpment where he worked for 18 hours is now covered with vegetation. The caves where Japanese soldiers fought are sealed. The ground where so many men fell is peaceful, visited by tourists and students who can barely imagine the hell that once consumed this place. But the principle remains, taught in every combat medic course, embedded in every high-angle rescue doctrine, remembered by every soldier who understands that weapons are not the only tools that win wars. 75 men, 18 hours, one rope, 0 shots fired. The conscientious objector who proved that the most powerful weapon in war is the courage to save lives when everyone else has given up. The medic who invented a rescue technique on the spot that would influence military medicine for generations. The soldier who kept his promise to God and to his fellow soldiers. One man at a time, one lowering at a time, one prayer at a time. Lord, please help me get one more. just one more.